Hello students. So today I am going to talk about very important topic, that is properties of food. Now the questions come with this chapter a lot because whatever the food is going through while maturing or while cooking, you should be knowing the properties of the food, and today we are going to talk about that only. So let's talk about what is properties of food. Now the properties of the food, what it is, basically the food, all the food have various constituents in it, like water, lipid, proteins, carbohydrates and enzymes. These are the constituents which consist of a food, and each component has its own physical and chemical characteristics. Now this physical and chemical characteristics only gives the final property of the food product. Okay, so let's talk about what are these properties. There are various properties like the physical and chemical properties. First we'll talk about the physical properties. Now physical properties, that means they can be observed without changing the identity of the subject. If the food is going through the physical property, that means the identity of the substance is not being changed. What are these? They are color, texture, density, viscosity, change in the state, that means either liquids or gases or solid, solubility, malleability, mass and volume. These are the components of physical properties. So various questions comes by this way ki what is the physical property, what are the characteristics which we are in the physical property. So you should be knowing ki all those properties which can change but they cannot change the identity of the substance are called physical properties. And what are the chemical properties? The chemical properties means that there is definitely any changes, and just because of these changes the identity of that food product has been changed. Now what are these? They can be reactivity, toxicity, pH, conductibility, tarnishing, fermenting and oxidation. These are all the properties which change the food of the final product. So let's talk about individually what are the physical properties. These are basically going to give a very important part when we are going through a new product development or benchmarking or deformulating or reformulating any speculations. Okay, so these are the physical properties. So let's talk about individually. The first one is the color. What is this color? It can be consistent and accurate measurements of the color. What it gives a visual appearance of the food product, and this is very, very important for any product to be acceptable. Now the color measurements, whatever the color are given to that food, it can be measured typically by C-lab scale. Now this is also a way to check to measure the color of the food, and this is the C-lab scale. Now the next property is the structure. Now the structure can be your property of that food. It can be true density, apparent density. We'll talk about individually about what is true and what is apparent density. Expansion ratio, how the food is expanded. The porosity, how much air is there in that product, and these are all linked to the rheological properties. So if the question comes that what is the rheological property of that food, you can say that the porosity, the expansion ratio and the density, these are including with the rheological property, and this actually gives you the behavior of the food component under influence of external and internal forces. Now the structure of the food influences the texture also. Like if the food is having a porous product like such as aerated foods or bakery products, what it happens, there is a bubble structure, and this bubble structure affects the softness and the starch based जितने भी snacks होते हैं, the snacks, they gives you a crispiness. Okay, so food system are generally compressible, hence the density changes with the temperature, pressure and composition. Now the porosity in the extruded products changes with the true or apparent density. Now we are talking about two density part, that is apparent and the true density. True density means the product is having a proper density, and apparent when the product has a porous or bubbles in the air, bubbles are there, then the product's density has been increased, but it is not a real density. That's why it is called as apparent density. Now the pumping requirement vary according to the flow properties, and X-ray microcity offers non-destructive imaging and structure measurements in 3D of that food product. So you can check the structure of the food through X-ray microcity. Okay. Next comes is the texture. The texture is very, very important as a sensory attribute because it affects the way the food tastes and how it feels in the mouth. This is called the texture. The texture depends on the rheological property of the food, and evaluation involves what? The measuring the response of food when it is subjected to forcing, like cutting, shearing, chewing, compressing or stretching. How the food is reacting, how the food is responding. This is called the texture of that food. Now let's talk about, we are talking about rheology a lot. Let's know what actually rheology or interfacial property means. The rheological properties of the food materials are very important in determining the texture, and as not only the texture but also how it behaves physically when it is subjected to physical forces or forced to flow. Okay, so what is the rheological property of the raw material or the intermediate product like the batter or the dough? These are going to let you know the property of the final products. Now this is basically a study. This is known as rheology study. Now the liquid foods are generally regarded as viscoelastic fluid, and they can strain rate dependent. Okay, the flow behavior of the liquid food can be expressed as pseudoplastic or Bingham due to the dependency of viscosity on the strain or shear rates. How it has been flowed, the flow behavior, it depends on the, it is basically a viscoelastic, and it depends on the strain and shear rate it is given to that food. Anisotrophic nature of the fluid of the solid or semi-solid foods result in the mechanical property that vary with the variation, the direction at which the stress is given. It depends on the stress direction depends on the structure of the food, and it is called as anisotrophic nature of the solids. Next comes is the chemical property. As you all know that chemical property means what? It is changing the identity of the food. The food is totally a different product when they are going through the chemical properties. And the food chemistry is basically a study of that chemical properties. It is the study of chemical processes and interactions of all biological and non-biological component of the food. Both components have to be taken care while we are looking for the chemical properties. Now, in general, this functional property of the food can be divided according to the component of the food, like it is a starch or protein or the fat. Now, when we talk about the starch, what are the chemical properties? In fact, functional properties and the chemical property is the same thing, so don't get confused. It is basically, we are talking about the chemical properties. Okay, the starch, how many starch these chemical processes are there in the starchy products. They are gelatinization, gelation, dextrinization. It depends ki what is the responses, what is the stress we are giving to that starch product. It depends on these are the processes which deals with the starchy foods. When we talk about the proteins, it is coagulation or denaturing of that protein, foaming, browning and emulsification. So we'll specifically talk about each and every process in our further slides. Then the last product, that is the last major nutrient, is the fats. And when we talk about fats, there are various functional properties of the fatty foods, which are aeration, emulsification and shortening. So let's talk about one more part, that is called colloidal dispersion. So you should be knowing, whenever we are talking about the chemical property of the food, there should be knowing that what are the colloidal dispersion of that substance. So substance can be either dissolved, dispersed or suspended in the water. It can be either dissolved, it has been all dissolved, you can't see that substance in the water when you are submerged in the water, or it can be dispersed, or it can be suspended. Fine. So there are three ways where the substance can be work when it is involved with the water. It also depends because of the particle size and the solubility. Now the small molecule like salt, sugars, what they do, they dissolve in water. Fine. So they dissolve in water, so make a solution. Fine. The molecules that are too big, that is between 1 to 100 nanometer, like cellulose or cooked starch, to form a true solution, may be dispersed in water to make a colloidal suspension. So you can see in a solution, you're not seeing any molecule of that substance, but in the colloidal, you can see a small particle of that substance because the molecules are little bigger. Then other particles that are very large, that is more than 100 nanometer, that is uncooked starch, or too large to form a colloidal suspension, then what it does, it suspend in the liquid and cannot be mixed with the water. So you can see the molecules are in suspended form. They are suspended down the vessel. Now the food colloidal system, when you know about the colloidal system, you should be knowing, you can easily understand what is food colloidal system. Now the colloidal system consists of two separate phases. The first one is the dispersed phase, which is the substance. Then is the dispersed phase, and this phase, that is disrupted or finally divided into within the emulsion. Then comes the continuous phase, the phase where it is continuously dispersing that substance and is suspended. And is the last one is the interface. So you should be knowing about the two part, that is dispersed phase and the continuous phase. The dispersed phase is what? The phase that is disrupted or finally divided in with the emulsion. And the continuous phase is what? It is the dispersion medium. So when we talk about the colloidal system in the food, for example, if we talk about milk, then it is a emulsion. Milk is basically a emulsion of two phases. The dispersed phase is also liquid and the continuous phase is also liquid. So it is an emulsion of two liquids to form a milk.